Hello and welcome to the Timur podcast. My name is James and I will be your host as you and I go back to investigate the life, conquests, character, and legacy of Timur. The recording that you hear now was recorded months after the episode you're about to hear was released, but going back to the first few episodes, I decided that an updated introduction was probably needed. So first of all, welcome to the Timur podcast. I am glad that you're here with me on this journey. Secondly, if you are familiar with Timur, then you probably know that most of the world does not actually refer to him as Timur. In the East, he's often called Amir Timur or Timur, and in the West, he's typically called Timur the Lame or Tamerlane. I decided to go with Timur, which is somewhat of a compromise between his various other titles. I talk more about this decision in a later episode, but just wanted to let you know now. Thirdly, you'll notice that the audio quality of the first few episodes is pretty terrible. I tried recording in a studio room at my library, but eventually found out that the quality of my apartment was superior. So the sound quality does improve a few episodes in, but don't be surprised that the first few episodes sounds as if I'm at the bottom of a swimming pool. And finally, I had originally intended to have only 1 or 2 introduction episodes that explored the historical and political pretext to Timur. But with Mongolian history being as complicated and important as it is, that soon stretched to about 10 episodes. So if you need a brush up on your Mongol Empire history, I suggest starting here with episode 1. However, if you want to jump straight to the coming of Timur, then head on over to episode 11, The Birth of Timur. And with all that said, I hope you enjoy, and always feel free to reach out to me for any time and for any reason. You can find all of my contact information at the show's website of timurpodcast.com. And with all of that said, let's begin. His name was Timur, and they say that on the night on which he was born, something like a helmet appeared, and it seemed to flutter in the air and then fell into the middle of the plain and was scattered over the ground. Then also live coals flew about like glowing ashes and collected so that they filled the plain and the city. The people consulted the wise men about the meaning of this, of whom some replied that he would be a guardsman, others that he would grow up to be a robber, while others said a bloodthirsty butcher or an executioner. And these opinions contended with each other until events decided the issue. This is the Timur Podcast. Welcome to the Timur Podcast. My name is James, and I will be your companion as you and I journey back in time to look at the man they call Timur, or Tamerlane, or Tamerlane, or Timur, or Temujin, however you want to say it. We will refer to him as Timur from now on, because, like I said in the trailer, it's easier for me to say, and I already had my cover art made. Anyway, our goal in this podcast series is to look at Timur and understand who he was, what he did, why he did it, and why does it even matter? So let's jump into it. Let's look at that first question. Who was Timur? Well, boiled down to a sentence or two, Timur was a man who emerged into history in Central Asia in the mid-1300s CE. He united a divided people, and then he conquered vast portions of Asia and the Middle East. And then he died. And that's about it. This podcast series has now come to an end, so thank you for supporting. Yeah, of course we're not done yet. But here's the thing. It is amazing how many modern historical accounts and books just explain away Timur with a sentence or two. And you'll read things that say things like, then this guy Timur came out of Central Asia, he killed lots of people, wanted to be Genghis Khan, let's move on. And yeah, I'm paraphrasing there, but that's often the general sentiment. And there is sort of an explanation for this, kind of. Basically, Timur has some steep competition on both sides of history. Chronologically speaking, Timur comes right after the Mongol Empire, the greatest, most expansive empire the world had ever seen up until that point. Then Timur lived, he did some things, then he died, and then the great Ottoman Empire arose, one of the greatest and expansive and important empires the world has ever seen. So sometimes you can kind of see why Timur is minimized, even if that's not an accurate portrayal of history, because of course it's not, but it gets worse. The further west from Timur's homeland you go, and particularly the closer you get to America, the more you'll find that Timur is just left out from history altogether. Now, to be fair, of course, Timur is remembered by all sorts of people all over the world, and in fact, largely due to the internet, there's been this growing of interest in Timur and Timur's legacy. And this is how it should be, because the more you look into the life of Timur, the more you realize just how incredible and impactful it is, and how amazing he was. And that's really the whole point of this podcast, to be a systematic investigation of the life of this guy they call Timur. So let's dive into it. If you enjoy history, and I assume that you do, and if you've been on the internet before, and I assume that you've done that as well, then you've probably come across this new hip way of explaining history. And if that doesn't ring a bell, maybe you'll remember the 10 top reasons why this new way of explaining history is the best way. Yeah, exactly. It's these listicle websites. The top 10 reasons why so-and-so was great. The top 15 reasons why this thing happened. The top 10 reasons why bread is bread. It doesn't matter. They're everywhere. And they're everywhere when it comes to history too, which is a good and a bad thing. The bad thing is that it often leaves out the big picture. You just walk away knowing, okay, I know 10 random things about Benjamin Franklin. Still don't know who he was, but I know these 10 things, so that'll help me get through school. But the good thing is that sometimes if it gets the kids interested in history, who am I to blame it? And unsurprisingly, you'll come across these lists when you look at Timur. Now, in our case, this isn't necessarily a bad thing because, at least what I saw, most of the facts that these listicle sites present are true when it comes to Timur. And not only that, but they form this useful foundation that we can all use to get on the same ground for jumping forward into the life of Timur. So to begin this study, this investigation of Timur the Lame, I decided to use some information that you'll just see everywhere when Timur is brought up. You will see this in the listicle sites, you'll see this in academic sources. Random people on the streets won't know who Timur was, but they'll know these weird facts about him. Okay, that might be a little too much of a stretch, but these things tend to follow Timur like a rain cloud wherever he pops up. So to make sure we're all on the same page, and to form that foundation of which we can leap into this investigation of Timur, we are going to look at 3 of these information statements that follow Timur around, and that's actually not true. We're going to start with 4 of these statements, but the first one doesn't count, because it's an overused lame joke, and I'm only going to use it once in this entire series, and that point is now. And that is, everybody knows that Timur was lame. That's what he's known as so many times, Timur the Lame, or Tamerlane, which is kind of a bastardization of Timur the Lame. Now, the reason why Timur is often called the Lame is because of a childhood wound, or a wound that he got early in his adulthood. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life, and we'll look into that. But for some reason, that's the title that stuck. He was this great conqueror, started a golden age, but history focused on his hobble. I don't know why, but for some reason, he's gone down in history as Timur the Lame because of a disability. Seems pretty cruel to me, but then again, there's kind of this justice to it because he was a cruel man himself. Now, of course, the joke that follows, and you'll see this everywhere, is that Timur was lame. Timur the Lame, he was lame, not because he had trouble walking, but just because he wasn't hip, as the kids these days might say it. I don't know. But, of course, saying Timur was that kind of lame is just entirely inaccurate. He did a lot of incredible things. So that's the first thing you'll see whenever Timur comes up, is that, ha, Timur the Lame. That's funny. Okay, that is the token lame joke of this entire podcast. So now that we have that cleared up and out of the way, let's move on to these 3 summary information tidbit things that you'll see. Wherever Timur pops up, these things follow. You will see people saying this, or hear them saying it. So let's get into this. Now, before we get into this, I just want to make something really clear really fast, and that is that a lot of the information in this story, the story of Timur, is, well, it's very violent and it will be disturbing. Now, I'm not going to leave it out because it's very important to the overall story, but that's just a warning that some of this information is, well, it's horrifying. And as we progress through the life of Timur, I will try to remember to give warnings of some of the material before we get to it. But this is just kind of my overarching warning that the story of Timur is disturbing. So now that you have that warning, let's get into the first fact that you always see. It follows Timur wherever he shows up, and that is this set of numbers, the numbers 17 and 5. Now, as I said just a minute ago, the story of Timur is a violent one. And 17 million, we'll take that number first, 17 million is the estimated amount of people who were slaughtered during the reign and the conquests of Timur. 17 million. Now, to illustrate just how terrible that number is, let's compare it with a few other bloody instances in the history of humanity. So let's look at the American Civil War, one of the bloodiest, if not the bloodiest conflict in the history of America, of the United States at least. Take a guess as to how many people died during this conflict. Well, estimates vary, of course, but the more liberal estimates, usually casualties of civilians and soldiers combined, they usually end up maybe at 1 million people, but usually between 600 and 800,000 people. Now that's horrifying, but Timur killed 17 million. Now let's take another instance, the Napoleonic Wars, the wars that happened because of Napoleon. How many people died? Well, again, estimates are sort of all over the place, but you'll usually see somewhere between 4 and 7 million people. Timur killed 17 million. Now, know that I'm not trying to belittle these conflicts of those who died, of course, but just comparing these numbers to events that might be more fresh in our mind just shows you how utterly devastating and how large 17 million is. And this leads us to the number 5, because when you look at a war or a genocide or any great loss of human life in history, there are two numbers that are important. First, how many people died? We have 17 million. And secondly, what percentage of the world population is that? Because the percentage shows us just how this affected the entire world. And as you've probably put together, 17 million was about 5% of the world population in 1400 or so. 5% of the world population just gone. Now again, to illustrate how large this number 5% is, let's compare another war in history. Let's look at the most violent war in human history, World War II. Take a guess, what percent of the world population was killed due to World War II? Well, of course, estimates are all over the place, but usually you'll see somewhere between 3 and 3.7% of humanity was killed in World War II. Timur killed 5%! Now, yes, of course, far more people died in World War II because the world population was higher, but if 3 or 3.7% can affect the world as much as we've seen it change after World War II, imagine how much the world changed after Timur wiped out 5%. So the first thing that you'll see pop up wherever Timur is these numbers 17 and 5. 17 million, 5% of the world. And people just love to throw these numbers around. But now that we've kind of compared what these numbers mean compared to other wars, they're actually kind of useful for setting the stage to Timur's story. We know that this story is just going to be utterly catastrophic to human life. It's going to be violent. There's going to be genocide and destruction really around every turn. So that is the first thing you'll often hear concerning Timur, is those numbers 17 million and 5%, which people like to wave around, but actually looking at those numbers and comparing it to the rest of history, now we know that this is huge. Why don't we hear about this more? Well, we'll get into that. But for now, let's move on to the second thing that you'll always hear when Timur comes up, and that is that Timur was the last great nomadic conqueror. You'll see this everywhere. Timur was the last great nomadic conqueror. Well, what does that mean? I have no idea, but that's what he was. It's a little less straightforward, so we're going to dissect it a bit. That word nomadic is what we need to clarify. For us living in the 21st century today, we view the word nomadic as a lifestyle that is still around in certain parts of the world, but by and large is one that is being slowly discontinued because of the growing settled populations. I live in a settled society, and you probably do too. We eat food that was grown on farms, we take that food to towns and cities to trade, and we connect our cities and towns with roads. As historian René Grousset puts it, and I love this phrase, we are a part of these immovable anthills. On the other hand, nomads living today, as they always have, travel great distances to find good grassland and pasture for their herds and their mounts, who serve as their primary source of food usually. Thus, our view of what a nomad is today is it's at least similar to the culture and lifestyle that nomads have always had. But there is one huge difference between how we view nomads today and how our settled ancestors viewed nomads of their day, and that is war. Neither you, nor I, nor our lands are at threat from a nomadic horse people bearing down on us, hopefully. Our historic and traditional enemies in recent years have been, well, usually other settled people. So I'm an American, and I apologize if you're German, but my country and yours they've had a scuffle or two in the past. And 80 years ago, if I was discussing a war with a fellow American about how to war, the conversation might sound something like, well, who are our enemies? It's the Germans. Well, where are the Germans? They're in Germany. What is their capital? It's Berlin. So very simply put, very simply put, the way we beat the Germans is we go to Germany, where they are, we take their cities, especially their capital Berlin, and yay, the war is complete. Now, the details of how to do that are a little more complicated, but that's the gist of it. That is the basic idea of defeating a settled foe. And throughout history, this has essentially been how you do war. If we were the Romans in the 200s BCE, well, who are our enemies? The Carthaginians. Where are they? North Africa. What's their capital? It's Carthage. So again, to defeat the Carthaginians, we need to take North Africa, blah, 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 blah. You know the drill. You get the point. But when your enemy is nomadic, this system doesn't work. Again, we could be Roman soldiers. Who is our enemy? The Huns, I think. But some of the Huns may actually be allied to us. And also, I don't even know if the people attacking us are Huns, but we'll deal with the specifics later. I guess the Huns are our enemy. Okay, great. Where are they? I have no idea. They could be 10 miles away from our border, they could be deep within our lands, or they could be 500 miles away. I have no idea. And even if I did, that could change within a day. I see. Well, where is their capital? Where can we strike? Where can we drive our forces to? They don't have one, and even if they do, it's not really their capital, and even if it was, they'd be far gone before we even got there. So you can see that things get difficult pretty quick, and to make matters worse, if you are part of a settled people in Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, or China, let's say sometime before the year 1400, well, guess what? You border nomadic people, and you border a lot of them. Because running through the northern half of Eurasia is the Eurasian steppe, of course, a gigantic plain of grassland that runs from Hungary and Bulgaria through the Ukraine, much of Russia, through Kazakhstan, and then into Mongolia and western China. There are a few mountain ranges and deserts here and there, but overall, this land it's perfect for hosting vast herds of animals and the horsemen who herd those animals. So pretty much since the dawn of humanity, nomadic tribes have flourished on these steppes, which is great. Except that it borders all of these little kingdoms and empires of settled peoples in Europe and the Middle East and Asia and China and so on and so forth. And running parallel to the steppe is the famous Silk Road, which means that there are going to be some pretty big cities, trade, and rich towns all along the steppe. Needless to say, conflict between the settled and the nomadic people, it's just bound to happen. So, as the leader of one of these settled kingdoms, how in the world do you fight against a nomadic people? Well, there are a few strategies that you can use, but here's the good news. You probably aren't going to need to fight the nomads. That's right, you probably won't. Because if they send a few raiders into our lands to disrupt our trade and carry off a few farmers, big deal! They'll run away the first time they see our military banners. And if they come down with an actual fighting force, true, we probably won't be able to meet them on the battlefield, but if that's the case, we can just pull behind our massive city walls and be completely safe. They are uncomfortable fighting on foot, never mind climbing over walls, so there's little these nomads can do to truly disrupt, never mind topple our government. And do you want to know the big secret? The big secret is that our greatest defense against the nomads is the nomadic people themselves. They may hate us, but they hate each other more, and their age-long rivalries with each other over a certain pasture land will keep us from ever having to worry about a united nomadic host. And this is most of history. The settled people do their thing while the nomads do their thing, and there may be some raiding here and there between the two, but that's about it. And actually, most of the time, you'll find them happily trading with one another because both groups of people make some amazing goods that the others want. So it's good. Life is good. We will have peace in our time. However, every once in a while, the impossible does happen. For some reason or set of reasons, the nomadic people unite. They put aside their age-old rivalries and they join together. Now, I'm not talking about all of the nomadic people on the Eurasian steppe, of course, but I'm talking about enough of them. Enough of the nomads to form an army so great in number and so skilled in combat that nothing can stand before them, and they ride over everyone in their way, meaning, of course, that eventually they come crashing down into the land of the settled peoples, grinding everything and everyone beneath the hooves of their horses. And even today, so removed from these nomadic threats, we still know the names of the men and the tribes who did this. Names like the Bulgars, or the Mongols, or the Huns, and men like Attila the Hun, or of course the greatest nomadic conqueror of all time, arguably, Genghis Khan. Those are names we all recognize. And a dozen or so times in history, these nomadic hordes, as they're often called, but that's very misleading, but these nomadic hordes disrupt all of settled history. And history can kind of be summarized as this sort of group of settled kingdoms who grows in power. Then they come across more settled kingdoms and they war with each other because that's what we humans love to do. And sometimes one of them wins. But then another settled people arises. And then out of nowhere, it seems, a vast horde of horsemen come washing over the settled kingdoms, laying waste to everything in their path. But nomadic kingdoms notoriously don't last long and usually quickly break apart, leading to the eventual rise of those settled kingdoms again, who begin to rise up and rebuild from the ashes, and then they start fighting each other, blah, blah, blah. This is kind of human history up until 1400 or so. A terrible summary, but a summary nonetheless. Now, before I go any further, I have to make something very clear. There is this tendency among settled people, and this is not just a European thing, although they do excel at this, but you can find this among all of settled peoples, and that is that, well, simply put, the victor writes the history. And culturally speaking, at least, the settled lifestyle it's won over the nomadic lifestyle. Most of the world, most of us are settled people. Further, most nomadic people in history, not all, but most of them have this annoying habit of not writing anything down. Thus, quite often we have to rely on the writings of the settled people to find out much of what we know about nomadic history. And that's biased as hell. And it means that nomads are often described as these backwards, dirty, horse-loving barbarians who do nothing in life but destroy and kill and pillage. I mean, think about it. There are reasons why Allied propaganda called our enemy, the Germans, Huns in World War I. Why? Because the Huns are dirty nomads. Anyway, the point of this being that, yes, undeniably the nomadic empires and conquests cost the lives of millions of people and created levels of destruction that, in many cases, hadn't even been seen in that certain part of the world. For example, scientists have been able to measure a decrease in global carbon dioxide in the wake of the Mongol conquest just because of all the humans who were killed. However, to paint nomadic peoples as uncivilized, backwards, and barbaric, it's just wrong and it's very misleading. And as we look into the Mongols and the Timurids more, we'll see why calling them uncivilized is it's inaccurate. So remember that while I keep throwing this phrase nomad around like it's a potato. Don't throw potatoes, it's dangerous. Anyway, now that has been cleared up, let's go back to that phrase, last great nomadic conqueror. Because you can't read anything without someone shouting that Timur is the last great nomadic conqueror. So now that we know what that means, can we call Timur a nomadic conqueror? Yes. And no, sort of. What does that mean? Well, to the question, was Timur's empire nomadic or settled, the answer is a solid yes. There's no denying that Timur was a nomadic conqueror, and a great one at that, but there also are very important settled aspects to Timur's story and his empire. For example, he may be a nomadic warlord, but the effort and resources and manpower that he puts into building up his capital city, it just borders on the ridiculous. Anyway, it's safe and accurate to call Timur the last great nomadic conqueror as long as we remember that there's actually more to it, particularly his settled empire. So that's the second kind of fun fact that you'll see revolving around Timur wherever he pops up. The first being, again, the 17 million people he killed, 5% of the world. Second being that he is a great nomadic conqueror, but there's a settled aspect to it. Now, finally, we get to the third fact that follows Timur wherever he shows up, and that is this. That basically Timur was amazing. He did incredible things, but he was nowhere near as good as Genghis Khan. In fact, sometimes you'll see people just say that Timur wanted to be Genghis Khan and utterly failed at it. Now, I'm not going to tell you whether this is true or not at this point in the podcast because, well, I don't really know yet. That's kind of part of the question of who Timur was that we're trying to figure out. But this claim is very helpful to us right now because it brings to the discussion a guy by the name of Genghis Khan, or Chinggis Khan, or Genghis Khan. However you want to say it, I'm going to use the name Genghis Khan. And Genghis Khan is important to us because to understand Timur's beginnings, we have to understand the political situation of Central Asia in the 12 and 1300s. And to understand that, we kind of need to talk about this guy Genghis Khan. Now, before we get into that, I need to say two things really quick. First of all, this is going to be a very, very quick summary of Genghis Khan's life. It's going to be insultingly short. Now, there is a reason for this, and the reason for this is, well, I have to end the episode at some point. And, more importantly, we are going to be referring back to Genghis Khan and the Mongols and the other Khans as we progress through the story of Timur. They are inseparable. The two stories are inseparable. So if you want to hear more about the Mongols, don't worry, you will hear more about the Mongols as we go forward. But here's the second thing. If you can't wait and you really want to know about more Mongolian history, then I can recommend two phenomenal podcasts really quick about the Mongols. The first podcast is, of course, Dan Carlin's Wrath of the Khans series. Now, the Wrath of the Khans follows kind of the beginning of the Mongol Empire, so it goes through the life of Genghis Khan and Ogadai Khan and a few others of the key leaders. And if you don't know who Dan Carlin is, he is one of the kings of history podcasting, and he has this way of telling a story and drawing the leader in that's just incredible. So if you haven't listened to Dan Carlin's Wrath of the Khans series, go listen. It's incredible. Now, the second podcast that covers the Mongol Empire is kind of an underrated podcast. I think it slipped under the radar of a lot of listeners, and that is Ben Hill's History of the Mongols. And this podcast really kind of focuses on the sources and the academic approach to the history of the Mongol Empire, but it also covers really the entire history of the Mongol Empire. It actually ends with Tamerlane, or Timur. So go listen to either one of those podcasts or listen to them together if you want more information on the Mongols right now. Now, of course, we will get to the Mongols all throughout this podcast series. Like I said earlier, Timur and Genghis Khan, Chinggis Khan, however you want to say it, they are inseparable. So we'll be referring back to the Mongol conquests quite regularly. So with that said, and without further ado, here is a very summarized version of the life of Genghis Khan. It should be a crime how much I am leaving out, but again, we will cover a lot of this in the future. So, Genghis Khan was not born with that name. He was born as Temujin, and the name Temujin roughly translates to iron or of iron, or most accurately, one who works with iron. Meaning that it's quite likely that Temujin had blacksmiths back in his family. But what's interesting to us is that going back to our boy Timur, the name Timur means iron or of iron. So 170 years or so before Timur is even born, and as this little child Temujin is named, the two already have this link. They are iron or of iron, or one of them works with iron and the other one is iron. That's kind of weird. But already we have this link between the two men, which is kind of cool. And it sets the stage for these two stories to be interwoven. Now, back to Temujin, his birth date is debated, but most agree it was sometime near or in 1162 CE, in modern-day northern Mongolia. And at this time in history, life in Mongolia was rough. Winters were harsh, food was often scarce, the tribes were not united, and so war and raiding were very common. And the young boy Temujin was born to this world, and life did not begin easy for him, obviously. While still a boy, Temujin's father, the leader of a tribe, was poisoned and killed. So Temujin, being the son of the leader of the tribe, attempted to claim his father's position as the rightful heir, but the tribe just flat out refused. And not only that, but they kicked Temujin and his family out of the tribe to fend for themselves. So Temujin, his siblings, his half-siblings, and his mother are now out in the vast Mongolian wilderness with no tribe for protection. And they're barely surviving on animal carcasses or these small rodents they can catch. So the next time you're having a bad day, just remember little Temujin on the Mongolian plains, kicked out of his tribe, feasting on an animal corpse. And while Temujin and his family are out in the wilderness, there is some classic family drama that I won't get into now, But it ends with Temujin murdering his half-brother, and then out of nowhere he's captured and enslaved by a tribe that used to be allied to Temujin's father. A little confusing, but we're going to go on. So eventually Temujin escapes from this tribe, and at this point Temujin is only maybe 15 or 16 years old. But nonetheless, people start to talk about him because he was kicked out of his tribe, but he lived. He was enslaved and captured, but escaped, and, well, he's surviving. Not only that, but he starts to gather small groups of followers, just a handful at first, but people who believed in him, who saw potential and were won over by his charismatic and powerful personality. Now, I know that I'm skipping a lot of really interesting information, but again, we'll be circling back to this as we go eventually to Timur and travel through Timur's childhood. There are a lot of similarities between Genghis Khan, or Temujin as he's now called, and the childhood of Timur. Anyway, back to Temujin. Surprise, surprise, life is still not great for him. He does manage to marry a woman who is a member of another tribe, which establishes this sort of alliance that Temujin can work with, so that's good. But then his wife is pretty much immediately captured by another people known as the Merkits, where she is married to somebody else, which is not good. This, of course, enrages Temujin, so he forms an alliance with a childhood friend of his, and they start to gather this actually substantial following of soldiers, of followers. A following of followers. That's redundant, but you get the point. So Temujin and this friend of his and their kind of little band of misfits, they defeat the Merkits, and they save Temujin's wife. And this victory it launches Temujin into further fame. And what's, again, really interesting is that Temujin's followers and his soldiers, they start growing in number quite quickly. And one of the primary reasons for this is that Temujin promoted, rewarded, and befriended people not based off of their tribe or family or class, but instead on their skill and merit and loyalty. There were exceptions, of course, but you can see how attractive this is in a society that usually only rewards members of important families or the upper levels of the aristocracy. But with Temujin, you can be pretty much anybody, and if you do your job well, he will reward you. And probably the best example of this from history comes from a battle that Genghis Khan, or Temujin as we're calling him now, would later go on to fight. And in this battle, there's, war is raging on both sides, but Genghis Khan, riding on his horse, gets a little too close to the action, which isn't good because, again, he's this charismatic leader that's holding his little band of followers together at this point. Well, because he gets too close to the action, one of the enemy archers actually sees Genghis Khan and shoots him in the neck with an arrow. Not great for this whole battle or for Genghis Khan's life. But Genghis Khan's soldiers, they carry him to safety behind the battle, and the arrow is removed, thankfully, for Genghis Khan's life. It wasn't a deep wound. And he's healed, and they go on to win the battle. The Mongols win. After the battle, these defeated peoples are brought together before Genghis Khan, and the situation for these prisoners of war doesn't look good. First of all, this is a time in history where prisoners of war are often they're all killed. And there are reasons, horrible reasons, but reasons nonetheless for that. But secondly, you're now being brought before Genghis Khan, who you almost just killed. That's not a good situation. And so Genghis Khan brings these prisoners before him, and there's no sign of his neck wound. And Genghis Khan, he shouts to the prisoners, "Who was the one who shot my horse in the neck?" Now, of course, his horse had not been shot in the neck, but Genghis was using this as sort of like wartime propaganda to show his own troops that it wasn't me who was wounded, and to show the enemy troops that, again, it wasn't me that was wounded, it was just my horse. Well, you can picture the silence and the fear of this scene as, well, first of all, Genghis Khan's own troops are probably furious. They like this leader who's winning them battles, and they want to know who in the world would dare try to shoot him or his horse. And you can see the Mongolian soldiers reaching for their swords and their axes and their spears, ready to fall upon these prisoners in just a terrible slaughter, but held back by Genghis Khan. And as for the prisoners themselves, who in the world would try and shoot the Khan? And what do you even do? How do you approach this situation? Your life is so far gone at this point. What do you even think? Well, after a few moments of this overwhelming silence, one of the prisoners stands up, and he shouts to his fellow comrades, to the enemy, and most of all to Genghis Khan, that I was the one who shot you. And I didn't shoot your horse in the neck. No, I shot you in the neck because I was aiming to kill you. And although my life is in your hands, I do not fear death. And as the legend goes, Genghis Khan was so impressed by the bravery of this prisoner that he let him live. Again, the standard rules of the day would have meant torture and surely execution for this prisoner for attempting to kill someone as prestigious as Genghis Khan. But Genghis Khan saw the utter bravery and the recklessness almost of this young prisoner, and so he let the prisoner live. Not only that, but he incorporated him into his army and made him a general. And really the best part of this story, this legend, is that Genghis Khan was so impressed by the bravery of this soldier that he gave him a new name. And this name was Jeb or Jebe, depending on how you want to say it. But that name translates to arrow. So Genghis Khan gives him a name that acknowledges that, yeah, you almost killed me with an arrow, but you're so brave that you're going to be one of my generals. And not only that, but Jeb or Jebe became one of the best Mongol generals in all of Mongolian history. So you can see that if you or I were just nobody peasants in the dirt of the Mongolian plains, how attractive this leader would be. He doesn't promote based on what my family name is or what your class is. He promotes based on what we do, how loyal we are to him, how brave we fight. So moving on with Temujin's life, for the next 10 or 15 years, he continues to spread his influence. And a lot of this part in history is lost to us, but we know that he had a few clashes with former allies, and they had really just become competitors to him for ultimate power. So yeah, he had to get rid of them. And there's a lot of drama with that, but we're going to skip over that for now. We also know that he defeated traditional enemies of his people, such as the Nayman or the Merkits, which again continues to launch him into further fame and power amongst his people. And there are so many stories and legends that surround this part in the life of Temujin, but for now, we're going to skip forward to the year 1206. By this year, Temujin had managed to build up his support base enough and eliminate his primary rivals that the major tribes in the area were united behind him, both politically and militarily. And our boy Temujin, who was probably now 40 years old or so, was named Khan, or supreme leader or ruler, over this tribal confederation that became known as the Mongols. And this union of the tribes and allegiance to a single ruler was pretty unprecedented on the Mongol steppe. Because remember, going back to earlier when we were talking about those nomadic tribes, well, the impossible has happened. Enough of them have been united. And Temujin knows this, or he's now called Genghis Khan, that is his new name. He knows that his people are ready for war. And so for the next 20 years or so, the Mongols go to war, and they are unstoppable. The first to feel the wrath of Genghis Khan and the Mongols was the Western Jia dynasty, or also known as the Tanguts, in northwestern China. They were an obvious first choice for Genghis as they were a neighboring faction, and they could be a problem later on down the road, so let's just take care of them now. And the Mongols do. They crush them. But this means that now the Mongols border the mighty Jin dynasty of China, one of the most powerful dynasties in the world, really, at this time in history. And, of course, the Mongols attack, because that's just what they do. And although this war would go on for 2 decades, it would end with the destruction of the Jin dynasty. Meanwhile, to the west, some of Genghis's old political enemies had fled to the mighty Khanate of the Kara Kitai, as they're often called, which is in modern-day Western China and Central Asia. And so, of course, the Mongols invade. And in 4 years, the once mighty Kara Kitai Khanate was completely under Mongolian control. And this is where the situation gets even more interesting because now this young Mongolian empire is bordering a new world, the Islamic world. Now, there were Muslims living within the Mongol Empire at this point, of course, but now they were bordering an Islamic empire, known as the Khwarezmian Empire, or sometimes the Empire of Khwarezm. Now, the Khwarezmian Empire, although we don't really hear about it all that often, but this was one of the powerhouses of the day. This was an Islamic empire that ruled modern-day Uzbekistan, Iran, Turkmenistan, parts of Afghanistan, and Kazakhstan. And although the empire was relatively young, it was powerful, rich, and somewhat prideful as well, or at least some of the leaders were prideful. And in one of the greatest tragedies of history, the rulers of the Khwarezmian Empire foolishly refused to trade with the Mongols and even killed some of the Mongolian ambassadors sent by Genghis Khan with a message of peace. Now, if you are new to Mongolian history, here is the number one rule. Never, ever, ever kill a Mongolian diplomat. Because sure enough, Genghis, he's enraged at this insult, and the Mongol armies just swarm into the Khwarezmian Empire, slaughtering and destroying and burning as they go. By the year 1221, the Khwarezmian Empire was gone, and the Mongolian banners were now seen as far westward as the Caspian Sea. Then, under the orders of Genghis Khan, Mongol armies marched, killed, pillaged, and enslaved their ways through Persia, Armenia, Georgia, the country Georgia, not the state Georgia, Azerbaijan, the Crimea, the southern plains of Russia, Afghanistan, parts of northern India, and finally they consolidated back in Mongolia, where they reformed and then plunged back into China to finish off the peoples there who were growing kind of restless under Mongolian rule. While campaigning somewhere in China, Genghis Khan died, either from a poisoned arrow or from an accident falling from a horse. We don't really know. There are a couple different theories. But whatever the reason, the mighty Khan was dead, and the world held its breath to see what would happen next. Because when a charismatic, powerful, and sole leader of a nomadic people dies, the empire that he has created almost always crumbles. And much of this is due to the fact that it was the man, either by his threats or the charisma or vision or a combination of these things, it was the man who united the tribes and held them together. So with this man gone, there was little to hold everybody together. And perhaps the clearest example of this is Attila the Hun, who I mentioned earlier. When Attila the Hun died, his Hunnic empire just collapsed almost immediately as his sons and his lords all tried to basically claim to be the heir of the empire, and few people listened, and they bickered among themselves, and before you knew it, the Hunnic empire was gone. But perhaps the most amazing thing about Genghis Khan, his most amazing accomplishment, was that his empire, which he made himself, remained intact after his death. And not only that, but it passed relatively peacefully down to his son Ogadai, who wasn't even his eldest son. But remember that Genghis Khan really believed in your abilities rather than these old traditional claims. And so even though Ogadai wasn't the oldest, he was, as Genghis saw it, the best suited to lead the empire on. At Genghis's death, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Caspian Sea in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east. And again, it didn't collapse. It went on to grow even larger. And we'll cover that next episode, but for now, getting back to the man Genghis Khan, hopefully from that tiny, insulting summary of his life, you can see that he's an amazing man. Amazing not in that he's a good man necessarily, but amazing in the way that nobody else could have done what he did. And when we go to the life of Timur, it's going to be the same way. What he manages to do is just incredible. Further, not everywhere, but almost everywhere that Timur conquers, Genghis or the sons of Genghis Khan had conquered just a few decades earlier. A lot of Timur's wars and sacking of cities kind of just feels like an echo of what came before. And it's a tragedy because it's a lot like World War I and World War II and the cities that suffered from both wars. They are annihilated by World War I, but the people return. They build up, and for a couple happy decades, things are good, and then World War II hits, and again, the city is flattened. It feels very similar between Timur and the Mongols, and that's why it's important to understand both stories. So again, that's the third statement that always follows Timur around, that he's trying to be Genghis Khan, or he's not as great as Genghis Khan, and we will explore that more, but for now we understand that Genghis Khan and the Mongols are inseparable to the story of Timur. So summarizing this all, taking those little facts that qualify as history these days, they're actually kind of perfect for us for setting the stage for Timur. First of all, we know that the story is going to be brutal and violent. Remember the estimates, the estimation of the people killed is 17 million, or 5% of the world population at that time. Secondly, we know that Timur's story is at least partially tied to the nomadic lifestyle and system of warfare, although there is an important settled aspect to that as well. And finally, the story of Genghis Khan is very important to the story of Timur. So where does that put you and I? Well, next episode we are going to bridge the political, cultural, and historical gap between Genghis Khan and Timur, because Genghis Khan dies 100 to 150 years or so before the birth of Timur. So connecting these situations is no small task, and it will take an entire episode, maybe even a few episodes to cover. But once we do that, the beginning of Timur's career will make so much more sense, given that we understand the situation in history and the geography and the political world around him. That's it. That is episode 1 of the Timur podcast. So, hey, thanks for listening to this episode. And if you enjoyed this and want to hear more, I have good news for you. There is more on its way. Episodes will be released in the future every Thursday, every week, which is redundant, but there you go. Also, if you want more material on the subject matter that we covered today or for future episodes, head on over to the website timurpodcast.com and look under the show notes section for, well, the show notes. I'll be posting maps, pictures, resources, further info, all that good stuff on the website. If you want to reach out to me for any reason at all, feel free to email me at timurpodcast@gmail.com or follow the show on Twitter at podcasttimur or on Facebook at timurpod. I'll be posting additional information and all the future episodes there, so that's a great way to stay in the loop. The cover art for the Timur podcast was made by the artist Quintus Cassius. He has some amazing work. There are some drawings of really neat historical battles and scenes, and also if you like Star Wars, he does a lot of Star Wars drawings. So go check out his work. I will include the links in the description below. Go check out his work. I humbly approached him begging for an album cover. I'm not making music. A cover art for this podcast, and he graciously gave me an amazing piece. So go check out his work. He does a really good job. Finally, before I end the episode, I have to do something. I have to apologize to you. As you very well may know, I wanted to release the Timur podcast back in May. Yes, back in May. It's now almost November. It's actually Halloween, so hey, my podcast is haunted. But it's haunted for other reasons because I wasn't able to release, obviously, until now, the end of October, which is a million years since when I wanted to release it. And if you've been waiting for that long, just thank you for your patience. I really mean it. I did not mean for this to take so long, but as you probably know, as soon as you want to do something with your life, life has a way of just throwing you into the deep end of the pool with everything it has. And a lot of things went wrong. I won't go into the details, but thankfully I'm in a better place with my life right now that this podcast can happen, and it is happening. So from now on, unless something horrible happens, which I should knock on wood for that, episodes will be released every week on Thursday. I'll keep you updated no matter what happens, and we should be good to go. But again, thank you for your patience. If you want to send me an angry email, feel free. Next week, as I mentioned earlier, we are going to look at the era in between the death of Genghis Khan and the birth of Timur. We'll see how this Mongolian empire fares after the death of its first Khan, and what new political entities rise up in the wake of the Mongol conquests, and finally where Timur comes into the story amongst all this change, war, and, well, chaos. Right here, next week on the Timur Podcast.